Have you ever wondered what it feels like when a regime doesn't just fall, it's hunted down, street by street, until its final breath is dragged into the dirt? What does the last hour of a dictator look like? Not in ceremony, not in trial, but in chaos, betrayal, and rage? October 20th, 2011, Libya. The world didn't just witness the collapse of a government, it witnessed a man, once untouchable, pulled from a drainage pipe by the people he once ruled. For over 4 decades, Muammar Gaddafi controlled Libya with an iron grip, a leader draped in symbols, paranoia, and gold. But in his last moments, there were no medals, no guards, just dust, fear, and the sound of the world closing in. Today, we step into the final hour of his life, not to glorify it, but to understand the anatomy of a brutal end. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. It's always powerful to see how far these stories travel. And if you want more raw, buried truths from modern history, tap subscribe, because what follows is not history rewritten. It's history unburied, minute by minute. It begins not in a palace, but in a pit. Sirte, once a stronghold, now surrounded. NATO warplanes in the air, rebel fighters in the streets. The city had become a maze of crumbled buildings and shallow trenches. Gaddafi wasn't leading anymore. He was hiding, moving in convoys, sleeping in abandoned homes. His once mighty circle had shrunk to bodyguards, sons, and whispers of escape plans. For days he tried to outrun the siege. He believed, even then, that he might slip through, that someone would come. That power, once absolute, would still protect him. But power doesn't bleed, it doesn't shield, it flees. And on the morning of October 20th, just before dawn, Gaddafi made his final move. A convoy of over 30 vehicles attempted to break out. Rebel intelligence got word. NATO jets were already circling. At 8:30 a.m., the missiles came. One blast, then another. The convoy exploded into fire and smoke on the edge of the city. Survivors scattered into the fields. Among them, Gaddafi, dust-covered, bleeding, still alive. He crawled into a concrete drainpipe, the kind that carries water beneath roads, no larger than a man's shoulders. The leader of Libya, reduced to a shadow in a sewer. Hours passed. He waited. He whispered prayers. He heard gunfire in the distance. Then, footsteps. Rebel fighters swept the area. One soldier kicked open the pipe's entrance. There he was, dirty, wild-eyed, clutching a golden pistol. No guards, no escape. Only the face of a man who realized, too late, that the myth of invincibility doesn't shield you from the mob. What happened next was captured on shaky cell phones, shouted through radios, and stitched together by survivors. There was no calm arrest, no official orders, just yelling, spitting, hitting, a lifetime of repression answering back in fists and fury. Gaddafi was dragged into daylight, blood running down his face, shoes missing. One of the most feared men in the Middle East, now begging, not for forgiveness, but for his life. And yet, no one stopped. The cameras rolled. The world watched live. The moment a regime died, not in a courtroom, but in gravel and gun smoke, his final words, they were buried under screams. Some say he asked, "What did I do to you?" Others say he said nothing. The bullets came shortly after. Not from above, not from a trial, but from the very people he once declared he would die for. And he did. Just not on his terms. The dictator of Libya, once feared across continents, spent his last hour not as a commander, but as a fugitive. Trapped, hunted, forgotten. It's a reminder that history doesn't always end in books or museums. Sometimes it ends in silence beneath a road. And by the time the dust clears, it's not the speeches that remain. It's the echo of what power looks like when it has nowhere left to go. The morning of October 20th didn't rise like a normal day in Sirte. The air was thick with diesel smoke, muffled by the sounds of distant shelling and close enough gunfire to keep everyone low. Gaddafi wasn't in a palace anymore. His world had shrunk to the interior of a ruined house along District 2, a coastal neighborhood now reduced to rubble and trenches. Concrete slabs leaned over broken tiles. Roofs had caved in. Once residential streets had become escape routes, sniper nests, and mass graves. But he wasn't alone. Around him were a shrinking group of loyalists, his son Mutassim, a few bodyguards, and scattered fighters who still believed somehow that escape was possible. Their food was nearly gone. Their water was rationed. They moved at night, whispered by day, their boots crunching softly over glass and ash. Gaddafi hadn't slept in a real bed in days. His green military jacket was streaked with dirt, his curly hair matted to his forehead, and his eyes, once hidden behind thick sunglasses, were bloodshot, darting, calculating. He carried a golden pistol in one hand and a small notebook in the other. No one knows what he was writing. Some say it was a final message. Others say he wrote nothing at all, just held it as a symbol of control in a place where he had none. That morning, the plan was clear. Break through the encirclement, leave Sirte, regroup in the desert. The convoy of vehicles, over 30 in total, was packed tight, engine blocks already running. Gaddafi climbed into one of the armored trucks. His son rode ahead, armed and silent. No speeches, no rally cries, just one final gamble in a war that had already been lost. But NATO was watching. For days, intelligence drones had hovered in the sky like steel birds, scanning heat signatures and radio frequencies. The alliance had orders: intercept any high-ranking loyalist trying to flee Sirte. At 8 a.m., the convoy began moving, slowly, then accelerating through the eastern edge of the city, following a dirt road that led into open fields. Dust trailed behind them. From above, they were a line of metal insects crossing dry earth. At 8:30 a.m., the first missile struck. A French fighter jet fired on the front of the column, detonating in a burst of flame that sent metal and limbs scattering across the road. Panic erupted. Vehicles veered into each other. Some swerved into ditches. A second missile followed, this time targeting the rear. Fire engulfed several cars. Survivors screamed and ran into the nearby fields, ducking behind trees, rocks, and whatever cover they could find. And in the middle of it all, Gaddafi's truck was hit. The blast wasn't direct, but the shockwave tore the side of the vehicle open, sending him and his guards hurtling to the ground. Dazed, limping, and bleeding from his head, Gaddafi staggered toward a nearby drainage culvert, a large concrete pipe meant to move water under the road. He crawled inside, head first, alone. His son and bodyguards scattered into separate holes. It wasn't strategy anymore, it was instinct, survival. A man who once gave speeches to millions was now curled into a wet pipe, inches from mud and rats, whispering to no one. Outside, the world burned. What followed was chaos. Rebel fighters, a mix of militia groups, some barely older than teenagers, had been closing in on Sirte's escape routes. They heard the explosions, rushed toward the smoke, and began combing the area. Hours passed. The sun climbed overhead. Shadows shifted. One fighter, reportedly from Misrata, kicked open the pipe entrance with his boot and shined a flashlight inside. He froze. There, crouched in the dark, was the man whose face had been printed on every banknote, whose speeches once boomed from every radio. He was covered in dust, hair wild, clutching a golden pistol and nothing else. For a moment, the silence hung, thick, surreal. Then the shouting began. "It's him!" The pipe filled with yelling, gun barrels, fists. Gaddafi was dragged out, not escorted, not arrested, dragged, like a wild animal from a trap. His face was cut, his uniform torn. Some say he tried to speak, others say he begged. Most agree that whatever he said was lost in the screams. One video shows him blinking into the sunlight, dazed, mouth open as if forming a word he no longer remembered how to say. Around him, chaos. Militiamen spat, cursed, struck him with rifle butts. Some filmed, others struck again. Someone pulled off his boots. Someone else held up a phone, recording every grim second. The war that had lasted 8 months had boiled down to a single man, defenseless, half-conscious, dragged across the dirt like a prize. There were no medics, no negotiations, just revenge, raw, uncontrolled, and fully human. And still, he lived. He was placed in the back of a pickup truck. The crowd swelled. A hand slapped him. Another gripped his hair. Blood covered his face, streamed from his scalp. Somewhere along the journey, someone fired a gun. The bullet hit him in the abdomen. Then another. It's still debated whether it was a deliberate execution or the chaos of uncontrolled violence. Either way, by the time the convoy reached Misrata, he was nearly dead. His body was taken to a local market freezer, not a hospital, not a morgue, a freezer. Crowds gathered to stare. Cell phones captured every angle. The once invincible dictator now laid out in silence, stripped of every layer of power he'd ever claimed. For 3 days, the body remained there, visible to the public. Crowds lined up, stared, whispered, snapped photos. It wasn't justice in any official sense, but to many, it felt like closure. A man who ruled by fear had died by it, and his final hour, not behind closed doors but in front of the entire world, became a symbol of how power can dissolve, not with policy, but with rage. But if Gaddafi's final hour was chaos, it was also a mirror, a reflection of decades of repression, control, and myth-making crashing into the reality of revolution. There were no final words read from a page, no soldiers saluting a fallen leader, just the wind over Sirte's shattered roads, just a man once larger than life, reduced to dust in a pipe, begging for mercy he'd never given. His last breath wasn't in a palace, it was in a ditch. In war, history is written by the winners, but endings like this are written by the crowd, by the blood still wet on the street, by the silence after the gunfire. And that silence, long and cold, was all that remained. The dust settled quickly, but the silence left behind rang louder than the gunfire. In the hours that followed Gaddafi's death, Libya didn't cheer in unison. Some cities lit fireworks, others went quiet. Misrata, where the dictator's corpse lay in a grocery store freezer, became the unofficial heart of this strange aftermath. Crowds gathered day and night to glimpse the body. Families brought children. People whispered to one another, some shocked, some satisfied, others unsure what emotion fit such a moment. For decades, Gaddafi was more than a man. He was a presence, a myth, a warning. Schoolbooks quoted him. Statues stood for him. Streets bore his name. But now, all that power, the titles, the uniform, the bulletproof glass, was frozen behind a clear plastic door next to sacks of flour. This wasn't just the fall of a regime. It was the erasure of fear, slowly, visibly, publicly. It felt unreal. But revolutions aren't always fireworks and speeches. Sometimes they're crowds in sandals walking through a warehouse, holding up phones, staring at a man who once stared back from posters. And while some Libyans danced, others wept. Not for Gaddafi, but for the questions his death didn't answer. What comes next? Who decides? How does a country rebuild when the tyrant is gone, but the chaos remains? Even among those who fought to end his rule, there was no clear plan. The National Transitional Council, Libya's temporary leadership, declared victory, but beneath the surface, tensions stirred. Militia groups that once united against a common enemy began carving out territory. Gaddafi had ruled with force, yes, but he'd also ruled with a brutal kind of unity. He kept tribes in check by playing them off one another, hoarded oil wealth to maintain leverage, and crushed dissent before it could turn into organization. With him gone, the pressure valve blew wide open. In Tripoli, Benghazi, and the mountains of Zintan, men with rifles became power brokers overnight. Roads were no longer just travel routes. They were borders, checkpoints, signals of who controlled what. And in that vacuum, the ghost of Gaddafi lingered. Not as a man, but as a symbol of what happens when authority collapses too fast for anything to grow in its place. International powers applauded his death publicly, but privately scrambled to assess what Libya would become. NATO, which had bombed his convoy hours before his capture, issued statements urging calm, yet withdrew shortly after. The world had helped kill a tyrant, but no one stayed to build the future. Meanwhile, his sons scattered. Some had died in the final battles, others fled into Niger, Algeria, or deeper into the desert. His wealth, once estimated in the billions, vanished, rumored to be hidden in gold bars across African states, or locked away in Swiss accounts under false names. His green books, the ones he claimed held the truth to perfect government, were tossed into piles and burned or left in sand-swept alleys. His palaces were looted, luxury cars rusted in courtyards, basements filled with graffiti and silence. One room, discovered beneath his Bab al-Azizia compound, revealed a private movie theater. Another, a stash of wigs and costumes, artifacts from a man obsessed with controlling how the world saw him. But none of it mattered now. His last costume had been dirt-stained fatigues. His final stage, a roadside ditch. His last audience, an angry crowd with cell phones and rifles. For a man who spent decades choreographing power, the end came unscripted, brutal, spontaneous, real. And then came the footage, uploaded in pieces, clipped, shared, watched millions of times. Shaky hands filmed Gaddafi's capture from every angle. Some showed his bleeding face, others caught the moment someone struck him with a shoe, a deeply symbolic act in Arab culture. No video showed mercy, none showed restraint, just chaos, rage, a collective scream finally given shape. But it wasn't just Libya watching, it was the world. Presidents, journalists, scholars, all viewed the same grainy clips, and opinions fractured. Some said it was justice, others a lynching. Some called it closure, others a warning, but few could deny its impact. In 1 hour, the myth of Gaddafi was destroyed more completely than years of sanctions or speeches had ever managed. He hadn't just died, he'd been erased. No final words, no legacy protected. Just an image, a man reduced to flesh and fear, dragged by those he once ruled. Still, in places like Sirte, the city where he was born and died, the end felt more like a wound than a victory. Bombed-out buildings remained untouched for months. Streets were littered with broken glass, rusting weapons, and stories that no one wanted to tell. Families picked through rubble not just for belongings, but for bodies, for answers, for pieces of a life before the war. And in the absence of a centralized government, warlords filled the silence. New flags rose, new slogans painted over the old ones, but the pain didn't fade. It shifted, became something else, a reminder that when a dictatorship ends in vengeance, healing becomes more complicated. And that's the deeper tragedy of Gaddafi's last hour. Not that he died as he did, but that his death didn't fix what he broke. Libya didn't collapse because he died. It collapsed because the system he built was never meant to survive without him. And maybe, in the end, that was always the plan. A ruler who made himself so central, so unavoidable, that even his downfall would cause confusion. He didn't build institutions, he built obedience. He didn't train successors, he eliminated them. Power was personal, rule by fear, not rule of law. So when he was gone, there was no scaffolding, just dust and echoes, and the people, many of them young men who had only ever known Gaddafi's Libya, were left to figure out what freedom even meant, in a place where freedom had always been a foreign word. So what does the last hour of a dictator really look like? It's not just the moment of death. It's the ripple, the confusion, the pieces left behind, the young fighters who now hold weapons, unsure who to follow, the empty palaces stripped of paintings but still smelling of control, the mothers burying sons lost in the crossfire, the flags raised, torn, and replaced again, the silence after the crowd goes home, when the dust settles and the power doesn't return. That's the last hour. It's not just his. It belongs to the country too. The power vacuum left behind after Gaddafi's death wasn't just metaphorical, it was physical. Across Libya, entire cities began to feel the absence of centralized control like a sudden chill through broken windows. Electricity faltered. Fuel ran short. Hospitals operated with flickering lights and whispered prayers. Neighborhoods that had once kept their heads low under the eye of the regime now lifted them, not with hope, but with uncertainty. In some places, celebrations still echoed, gunshots into the sky, chants of freedom. But in others, especially those still littered with the wreckage of NATO airstrikes and months of street fighting, the air grew heavier. Every man with a rifle believed he had earned a piece of the future. But futures aren't built with bullets, and Libya was fast becoming a country full of commanders, but with no army. The militias that had joined together to hunt Gaddafi now splintered, each loyal to its own town, its own tribe, its own version of what Libya should become. The Transitional Council struggled to gain respect beyond press conferences. Tripoli's government buildings, once symbols of iron rule, were now graffiti-covered reminders of a collapsed order. Some bore slogans of revolution, others were daubed with warnings, "Do not trust them." The vacuum grew. Into it stepped warlords, businessmen, foreign actors. Smugglers reopened desert routes, weapons from Gaddafi's stockpiles, anti-aircraft missiles, tanks, crates of ammunition, flowed into black markets across North Africa and the Middle East. What began as a national uprising now spilled beyond Libya's borders, arming extremists, trafficking networks, and destabilizing the entire region. Gaddafi had been one man, but the system he left behind bled chaos in 1,000 directions. And yet, through all of this, something else began to haunt the country, a silence. Not the silence of peace, but of confusion. In his final years, Gaddafi had deliberately dismantled any machinery of succession. He distrusted even his own sons. His rule wasn't about legacy, it was about control. That's why there were no clear ministers, no transition plans, no national emergency structure. He believed he would rule forever, or if not forever, then at least until the world bent again to his will. But time is a ruthless teacher, and history rarely pauses to wait for egos to adjust. In the end, Libya was like a stage without a script. The actors knew the tyrant had fallen, but the curtain hadn't come down. There were no directions, no finale, just smoke, shouting, and a country blinking in the light after 4 decades underground. International powers watched with cautious distance. NATO declared its mission complete. The US and European leaders who had once posed with Gaddafi in tents and photo ops now issued cold, measured statements. The Arab League, long wary of Gaddafi's unpredictability, stayed mostly silent. In global politics, dictators die, but diplomacy continues. the focus shifted quickly to Syria, to Iran, to other front lines. Libya became another case study, another warning, another scar on the map. But for the Libyans who lived it, who had buried loved ones, fought on the streets, lost homes and futures, the war didn't end with his death. If anything, the war had only just begun. In Misrata, where Gaddafi's body had been kept for public viewing, the line eventually slowed. The smell of decay began to overtake curiosity. Clerics debated what to do. Some argued he deserved no burial rites, that he had violated Islam with his brutality. Others said every man, no matter how cruel, deserved to be buried. Eventually, under nightfall and secrecy, his body, along with that of his son Mutassim and his defense minister, was taken into the desert. No monument, no marked grave, just sand. They feared his grave might become either a shrine or a target, so they left nothing behind, just coordinates buried in silence. And still, Libya did not settle. Cities like Benghazi, once the heart of the revolution, became battlegrounds again. Assassinations rose, kidnappings, street justice turned deadly, journalists disappeared. And amid this chaos, some began to ask questions they were once too afraid to voice. Had Gaddafi, despite his cruelty, kept the country more stable than what followed? Had the West, in its rush to support the uprising, failed to prepare for the consequences? These weren't defenses of dictatorship. They were cries of exhaustion, of people stuck between the past they escaped and the future that hadn't arrived. It's a pattern history knows well. When empires fall, when tyrants are torn down, there's always a void. And the louder the fall, the deeper the silence afterward. Libya's silence became filled with competing voices. Political Islamists, tribal elders, foreign-backed generals. In time, the country split in two, then three, then more. Elections failed. Constitutions stalled. In the decade that followed, Libya saw multiple governments, multiple armies, and very few answers. And yet, the footage of Gaddafi's last hour remained, still online, still raw. It became a symbol, not just of his death, but of everything that came after. The risks, the choices, the warning that toppling power is not the same as replacing it. And so we return to the drainage pipe, to that cracked piece of concrete on the edge of Sirte. It's still there, overgrown now, but not forgotten. Some passers-by avoid it. Others stop and stare. It's not marked on maps. No sign declares what happened there. But locals know, soldiers know. And somewhere, perhaps, a man remembers how close he stood to a dictator in his last breath. How Gaddafi looked up, not as a leader, not as a martyr, but as a man, tired, confused, and very human. That moment, more than anything, stripped the myth away. Power doesn't leave with speeches. It leaves with silence, with blood in the sand, with a look of disbelief in the final second before everything ends. What happened in the final hours of Muammar Gaddafi's life didn't just mark the death of a man, it marked the unraveling of an era that had defied global norms for over 4 decades. But to truly understand the brutality of his fall, we have to go minute by minute, back to that last day, October 20th, 2011, and trace it not from a political lens, but from the dirt roads, the human choices, the panic, and the blood. Gaddafi didn't die in a war room or from the distance of a drone. He died close, personal, face to face with the very people whose pain had been buried under the weight of his control. That day began with him on the run, literally, trapped inside the collapsing city of Sirte. Surrounded by rebel fighters, his convoy made one final, desperate push to escape. There were no backup plans left, no allies coming to rescue him. Just 30-some vehicles, filled with loyalists, racing toward the edges of the battlefield. But Libya's sky was no longer theirs. NATO jets, scanning, circling, struck swiftly. A missile tore through the convoy just after 8 a.m., scattering fire and flesh into the dust. Survivors staggered out, dazed, wounded, terrified, and somewhere in that chaos, Gaddafi himself emerged, bloodied but breathing, crawling into a roadside drainpipe like a hunted animal. This is where time slowed. Multiple sources confirmed that after the strike, Gaddafi, his son Mutassim, and a handful of bodyguards crawled through the wreckage, dodged gunfire, and eventually hid beneath a highway, in a concrete culvert, barely wide enough for one man to crouch in. The man who once built golden halls and hosted world leaders now sat in the filth of Libya's underbelly, clutching a gold-plated handgun that wouldn't save him. Around him, rebel fighters swarmed the area. A few had heard whispers over the radio. He's alive, he's hiding, somewhere close. And then, a soldier's foot kicks open the mouth of the culvert. Flashlights sweep in. Guns rise. Silence snaps. And just like that, history bends. What followed was not justice. It wasn't a trial. It wasn't order. It was the full force of collective fury. A crowd formed quickly. Some fighters cheered. Others screamed. Cell phones came out. Hands grabbed, pulled. Gaddafi was dragged out by his hair. His golden pistol fell to the ground. He was still alive, still muttering. Some claim he begged. Others say he asked, "What did I do to you?" But what he said didn't matter anymore. For those around him, what mattered was everything he had done before. The decades of fear, the disappearances, the killings, the mocking speeches, the taunting of the West, the iron grip that had crushed voices for years. It all came crashing back in one uncontrollable moment. He was beaten, stripped, bloodied. A knife or bayonet may have been used, though reports differ. There were too many hands, too much noise, too many fractured accounts. A pickup truck arrived and his body was thrown into the back. Alive, but barely. Along the way, more beatings, more shouts. The convoy stopped, started, argued. Chaos. One of the fighters reportedly pulled the trigger. A bullet, or several, ended it. And with that, Libya's longest-serving leader was no more. But here's the haunting part. Even after death, Gaddafi's body remained a symbol. It was not immediately buried. It wasn't taken to a morgue. It was laid out in a cold storage freezer in Sirte, a makeshift public display where citizens, press, and soldiers came to see the end of tyranny with their own eyes. Children were lifted to peek. Elderly men wept. Some spat. Others prayed. The lines stretched long. People brought cell phones to take photos, images that would circulate the globe within hours. In a world obsessed with strongmen, the sight of a dictator's lifeless body, still smeared with dirt and blood, felt both surreal and terrifying. This wasn't just news, it was a rupture in the myth of untouchable power. As days passed, the new leadership realized that something had to be done. The body, now decomposing, could no longer be paraded. Debates erupted. Where should he be buried? Should he be buried at all? The fear wasn't just about religious protocol, it was about legacy. A grave might become a shrine for loyalists or a target for enemies. In the end, under the cover of night, Gaddafi's body, along with those of his son and close aides, was taken into the desert. No ceremony, no gravestone, just an unmarked location, deep beneath Libya's sands. A dictator returned to the dust, nameless, forgotten by coordinates, but not by memory. In the aftermath, the footage of his capture and death sparked international controversy. Human rights groups questioned the legality of the killing. The UN called for an investigation. Some argued it was a war crime. Others said it was inevitable, the raw result of a brutal dictatorship collapsing without a safety net. But the moral questions were never resolved. Libya had no courtroom strong enough to hold its grief. And by the time international attention moved on, the country had already begun to fracture. The rebels who had once fought side by side against Gaddafi's forces now turned against each other. Militias refused to disarm. Tribes staked claims. Terror cells took root in the cracks. The fall of one man did not bring peace. It brought a new kind of storm. So what can we learn from a death like this? That the end of tyranny is rarely clean. That justice, when delayed for too long, can morph into vengeance. That power, when hoarded by one man for too long, becomes impossible to transfer without violence. And maybe most of all, that history doesn't end when a ruler dies. It begins again in confusion, in blood, in the questions we're still too afraid to ask. The body was gone, but the aftermath had only begun. The fall of Muammar Gaddafi didn't end in the drainage pipe. It began there, because what unraveled next wasn't peace or stability, but a vacuum, one so vast, so chaotic, that it would reshape not only Libya, but the geopolitical map of North Africa and beyond. In the hours after his death, celebrations erupted across parts of Libya. Flags waved, gunfire sprayed into the sky. Crowds gathered in Martyrs Square, chanting the end of a man who had ruled for 42 years. But beneath that relief, beneath the shouts of freedom, was something colder, something more unstable. The war had removed a dictator but not solved the question of who would lead next, because when a regime built entirely on one man collapses, it doesn't leave behind structure. It leaves behind fragments, tribes, militias, ideologies, and unhealed wounds. Gaddafi had ruled not through unity, but division. He kept the country fractured, making sure no single group became powerful enough to challenge him. He distributed power to loyal tribes, played enemies against each other, and centralized control through fear. So when he vanished, so did the only glue holding those factions in place. Within days of his death, militias who had fought side by side began carving out their own fiefdoms. In Misrata, Zintan, Tripoli, Benghazi, armed groups set up checkpoints, took over government buildings, and refused to disarm. Everyone wanted a piece of the new Libya. No one agreed on what it should look like. The transitional government, the National Transitional Council, tried to restore order, but it had no real control. Its authority was symbolic, not enforced. In some areas, the law was written by whoever had the most guns. Chaos didn't just return, it evolved. Political vacuum turned into territorial conflict. Former revolutionaries turned warlords. Islamist factions, sidelined during the uprising, began asserting power. And in the shadows, even darker forces began to stir. By 2014, the country had split into two rival governments, one in Tripoli, another in Tobruk, each claiming legitimacy, each backed by their own militias and foreign allies. The dream of a united democratic Libya had faded. In its place stood civil war. Entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds. Airports were shelled. Oil fields were seized and ransomed. Civilians, the same people who had cheered Gaddafi's death, found themselves caught in a new storm. One with no single face, no clear enemy, and no promise of ending. And yet, the world watched, uneasy, distant. For Western powers, Gaddafi's fall was supposed to be a victory, a model of intervention. NATO had stepped in to prevent a massacre, supported rebels, and helped topple a dictator without putting troops on the ground. But they hadn't planned for the aftershock. They hadn't stayed to rebuild. And in that silence, something else crept in. ISIS. By 2015, the terror group had gained a foothold in Libya. Exploiting the chaos, they seized the coastal city of Sirte, the very place where Gaddafi had died. It was a symbolic invasion, a twisted full circle. The streets where Libya's dictator took his final breath now echoed with black flags, executions, and propaganda videos. For a time, Sirte became ISIS's North African stronghold, launching attacks across borders and threatening Europe's southern flank. But even beyond terrorism, Libya became a crossroads of global consequence. Refugees fleeing conflict in Africa began using its shores as a gateway to Europe. Human trafficking networks flourished in the absence of law. arms smuggled out of Libya found their way into conflicts in Mali, Syria, and the Sinai. What began as a revolution had metastasized into a regional wildfire, and through it all, one image lingered, the image of a man pulled from a pipe, screaming beneath the weight of the mob. Not because people sympathized with Gaddafi, but because that image became a warning, a symbol of what happens when power ends, not with transition, but with vengeance. Leaders across the Middle East watched it closely. Bashar al-Assad in Syria, for one, drew his own conclusions. Better to fight to the end than surrender. Better to level cities than let them celebrate your fall. The brutality of Gaddafi's last hour may have shocked the world, but it also echoed forward, influencing how other regimes prepared for collapse. In Libya, the myth of the revolution began to decay. The young fighters who had once believed they were ushering in democracy now found themselves trapped in cycles of militia violence. Assassinations became common. Journalists were targeted. The country's oil wealth, once a possible tool for rebuilding, became another point of conflict, fought over by rival groups, siphoned off by corruption, and manipulated by foreign powers. Gaddafi's family, meanwhile, scattered. Some were captured, others fled to neighboring countries. His son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, was imprisoned, then later released. At one point, he even announced his intent to run for president, reigniting old fears and forcing Libyans to confront a haunting question. What if the revolution changed nothing? What if the face changed, but the system remained broken? And yet, through all of this, there remains a silence, a gap in Libya's story. No real reckoning, no full truth and reconciliation, just fragments, rumors, unmarked graves, and a generation raised in a country that still doesn't know what peace looks like. Because in the end, the brutal fall of Muammar Gaddafi wasn't just about one man. It was about what happens when history is forced underground for too long, when voices are silenced for decades, when power is hoarded, then shattered. The final hour may have been swift and televised, but the real ending stretched on, through every broken institution, every lost child, every silence that still haunts the Libyan night. Long before the bullets, before the bunker, before the drainage pipe where it all ended, Muammar Gaddafi's fate had been written. Not in one moment, but over years of slow erosion. Because dictators don't just fall, they rot. And the rot begins in the minds of those they rule. For decades, Gaddafi had built a system not of governance, but of paranoia. Fear was not just a consequence of his regime. It was the design. People didn't follow him out of love. They followed him out of calculation, self-preservation. What he built in Libya wasn't a country, it was a stage, and for years the performance held. He wore the costumes of kings, prophets, and philosophers. His speeches were erratic, almost poetic in their chaos, yet broadcast like scripture. His image, on buildings, on billboards, in classrooms, became larger than life. So large, in fact, that the man behind it disappeared. What remained was a symbol, a revolutionary turned ruler turned warning. But symbols can't feel. And when they break, they shatter completely. Underneath the surface of Libya's controlled media and choreographed patriotism, discontent festered. It started in whispers, in cafes, in markets, on the lips of students and elders who remembered what freedom once felt like. But the regime had ears everywhere. Gaddafi's intelligence network was legendary in its reach and cruelty. Neighbors reported neighbors, students reported teachers. Families learned to censor themselves at dinner tables. One wrong word could mean a disappearance, a detention, a grave without a name. Yet even the strongest fear cannot suppress hope forever. And in 2011, the Arab Spring began to crack open a region long frozen in dictatorship. Tunisia fell, Egypt followed, and Libya, long thought unshakable, began to tremble. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it was a protest in Benghazi, then a crackdown, then funerals, then more protests, and suddenly, the stage Gaddafi had ruled from for over 40 years began collapsing beneath his feet. But what made Gaddafi's fall different was the sheer disbelief, both among his supporters and his enemies, that it could actually happen. He had survived so many attempts, assassination plots, coups, sanctions, bombings. He had stared down Ronald Reagan, outmaneuvered Western diplomats, made allies of enemies and enemies of allies. For many, he was invincible until he wasn't. And when the illusion cracked, it shattered fast. The same people who once bowed now armed themselves. The same cities that once held his portraits now set them on fire. His military fractured, defections piled up, and for the first time in decades, Gaddafi was no longer giving orders. He was fleeing them. But his downfall wasn't just military. It was psychological. The very system of control he had built, fear, surveillance, loyalty bought with favors, began to implode from within. Officers no longer trusted their commands. Spies no longer reported. Civilians no longer whispered, they shouted. And in that chaos, Gaddafi seemed unable to comprehend what was happening. He appeared on TV calling protesters rats. He insisted that his people still loved him, that the uprising was a foreign conspiracy, that he would die a martyr. But what he couldn't grasp, or refused to believe, was that the people weren't listening anymore. His words had become noise, and in a world where information now traveled faster than fear, his myth was finally outpaced by reality. In his final weeks, Gaddafi still believed there was a path out. He held meetings in safe houses, recorded defiant audio messages, and promised victory even as his map of control shrank by the hour. Sirte, his birthplace, became his last stronghold, not because of strategy, but because it was the only place left. He moved through the city like a ghost, shielded by loyalists, but abandoned by history, no longer a ruler, barely a fugitive, just a man trying to outlast a truth that had already been written. And in this psychological unraveling, something else became clear. Gaddafi wasn't just losing power, he was losing belief in himself, in his myth, in the system he had crafted so obsessively. The man who once held audiences in Rome, who posed with African kings, who gave marathon speeches in golden tents, now slept in basements and moved through bombed-out streets like a criminal. The pageantry was gone. The silence around him was not reverence, but absence. He had built a regime on isolation, and in the end, he died completely alone. There's a moment, mentioned by one of his former bodyguards, where Gaddafi, sitting in a dimly lit safe house, asked no one in particular, "Do you think they'll remember me as a hero?" No one answered, not because they didn't know what to say, but because they knew the answer wouldn't matter. The story was no longer his to tell. It belonged to the streets, to the rebels, to the cameras, to the crowd gathering above the drainpipe. And that is perhaps the final cruel irony of his downfall. For all his paranoia, for all his obsession with control, Muammar Gaddafi did not die in secrecy. He died in the most public way possible, filmed, shared, dissected, and replayed across the globe. His last image wasn't crafted in a propaganda office. It was captured on a shaky phone by a boy with dusty shoes and adrenaline in his voice. A dictator dragged through the dirt by the people he once crushed. Because in the end, no matter how tight the grip, no matter how elaborate the myth, no power survives forever. And for Gaddafi, the collapse was total, not just of a regime, but of an idea. That fear could rule without end, that symbols could live longer than truth, that a leader could outlast the people. He was wrong. When a regime falls, the rubble doesn't stay where it landed. It spills, it echoes, it spreads into places far beyond the borders where it began. And Gaddafi's fall was no exception. In fact, the brutal way his life ended created one of the most chaotic aftershocks in modern geopolitics. Because Libya wasn't just a country. Under Gaddafi, it had been a dam, a strong man's fist holding back the currents of civil war, tribal tension, militant Islamism, and one of the most powerful migratory routes from Africa into Europe. And when that fist vanished, when Gaddafi's body was paraded through Sirte's streets and his voice went permanently silent, the dam broke. It didn't take days, it took hours. And the chaos that followed would alter the lives of millions far beyond Libya's burned-out cities. First came the vacuum. Power, once absolute, was gone, and there was no plan, no heir, no transitional government with true authority. Rebel militias, once united by a common enemy, fractured almost immediately. Each group claimed parts of cities. Some were loyal to tribal leaders, others were backed by foreign interests. Still others, the most dangerous, had their own flags, their own weapons, and their own interpretations of what justice meant. Within weeks of Gaddafi's death, Libya became a patchwork of checkpoints, secret prisons, and shifting allegiances. Sirte, Misrata, Benghazi, they weren't just names on a map anymore. They were battlegrounds in a country with no referee and no rules. Then came the weapons. Gaddafi's arsenal was legendary. Tens of thousands of rifles, surface-to-air missiles, anti-tank systems, explosives. For decades, Libya had stockpiled arms with little oversight and deep paranoia. And when the regime fell, those stockpiles were raided, not secured, not cataloged, just taken. Some went to local militias, others disappeared into the deserts, but a shocking number made their way across borders, into Mali, into Sudan, into the hands of extremists in Syria, and later into the arsenals of terror groups like Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. The fall of Libya became the arms bazaar of a new era of conflict, and Gaddafi's ghost haunted every bullet fired in his absence. But perhaps the most human and heartbreaking consequence was the collapse of Libya's role as a gateway. For years, Gaddafi had acted as Europe's unofficial gatekeeper. He had cut deals with Italy and the EU, promising to stem the flow of African migrants heading north across the Mediterranean. In exchange, he received billions in aid, technology, and political forgiveness. But once he was gone, so was the gate. Libya's coastal cities, once patrolled, became launch pads. Smugglers thrived, boats were overloaded, and the sea, already dangerous, became a graveyard. Tens of thousands attempted the journey, not just Libyans, but refugees fleeing war, poverty, and climate collapse from across the continent. Eritreans, Somalis, Nigerians, Sudanese. The route through Libya became the fastest and deadliest path to Europe. And with no government to regulate or rescue, the journey turned into a brutal lottery of survival. Shipwrecks, drownings, human trafficking rings that operated with impunity. By 2015, the European migrant crisis had reached a breaking point, and at the center of it was a vacuum that began with a golden pistol, a drainage pipe, and a dictator who believed his death would mean martyrdom. But there was no martyrdom, only fallout. The political aftershocks were just as violent. Western nations, especially those that had supported the NATO strikes, France, the UK, the US, now faced the question, what next? The initial celebration of Gaddafi's fall quickly gave way to criticism. There had been no post-war plan, no coalition ready to stabilize, no understanding of how deep Libya's tribal divisions truly ran. The vacuum was predictable, and yet no one filled it. The war had ended, but the peace had never begun. For the Libyan people, daily life became a negotiation with chaos, blackouts, inflation, checkpoints that changed allegiance by the week. Oil revenues, once the backbone of the economy, were siphoned by rival factions or halted altogether. The dream of freedom that had surged in 2011 began to wither under the weight of corruption, violence, and foreign interference. In many cities, nostalgia for Gaddafi, once unthinkable, began to return, not out of affection, but out of despair, because even brutal order, some reasoned, felt safer than endless disorder, and in that atmosphere, new threats emerged. By 2014, ISIS, already establishing its caliphate in Syria and Iraq, saw Libya as fertile ground. In the vacuum of power, amid disillusioned fighters and abandoned cities, they planted a flag. Literally, they captured territory, staged executions, and claimed attacks. Sirte, Gaddafi's birthplace, his final refuge, became their stronghold. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. A new tyranny had risen from the ashes of the old, and the cycle of violence, which the world thought had ended in 2011, had only just begun. But the tragedy of Libya's collapse isn't just geopolitical, it's deeply personal, because behind every statistic, every drowned migrant, every armed child soldier, every woman trafficked through the desert, is a face, a name, a story that never got told. And while the world remembers Gaddafi's fall in images, his battered face, the golden gun, the cheering crowd, it forgets the silence that came after, the lives unraveled, the generation raised not in freedom, but in fractured futures. That is the real legacy of the last hour, because the end of a dictator does not mean the beginning of peace, not without planning, not without rebuilding, not without understanding that when you remove the center of a brutal system, what you leave behind isn't always democracy. Sometimes it's a deeper kind of chaos, one that seeps into borders, into lives, into history itself. History has a strange way of echoing itself, not always in grand declarations or famous speeches, but in quiet mistakes repeated with eerie familiarity. After Gaddafi's fall, the world didn't just watch Libya spiral into chaos. It began to recognize the same pattern in other regions: swift military victories without plans for peace, promises of democracy drowned out by factional violence, strongmen removed only to be replaced by something worse. And in that way, Libya didn't just become a failed state, it became a case study in what not to do. A mirror held up to global powers who had once cheered from the sidelines, now confronted with the question, what happens after the fall? In the years that followed Gaddafi's death, the memory of that last hour, the sewer pipe, the mob, the blood and the dust, didn't fade. It lingered in policy rooms, foreign offices, and war rooms across the globe. Because for all the power NATO projected in the skies above Sirte, it failed to build anything on the ground. And that failure became a blueprint for how interventions would go wrong again. In Syria, in Yemen, even in Afghanistan, comparisons were drawn. Take out the regime, celebrate the victory, then leave before the hard part begins, before the rebuilding, before the healing. Libya exposed a gap between military power and political responsibility. And that gap became deadly. But Gaddafi's ghost didn't just haunt global policy, it haunted his own country in brutal, visible ways. After his death, Libya held its first democratic elections in 2012, a moment filled with hope, banners, and long queues of voters eager to shape a new destiny. But the euphoria was short-lived. The elected government, based in Tripoli, soon faced opposition from rival factions, former rebels, and Islamist militias. By 2014, the country had fractured into two competing governments, one in the west, one in the east, each claiming legitimacy, each backed by different foreign powers. This proxy war turned Libya into a chessboard for outside interests. Egypt and the United Arab Emirates supported the eastern faction, led by General Khalifa Haftar. Turkey and Qatar backed the Tripoli-based government. Russia sent mercenaries. The US watched from a distance, and amidst it all, the Libyan people, ordinary citizens, were caught in the middle. Airstrikes lit up the sky. Hospitals were bombed. Families fled their homes, not once, but multiple times, as front lines shifted back and forth. The dream of a post-Gaddafi Libya collapsed under the weight of external agendas. Meanwhile, Gaddafi's family re-emerged from the shadows. His sons, once despised, began to rebuild their reputations. One son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, who had been captured, imprisoned, and later released, began making political speeches again. Incredibly, by 2021, he announced his candidacy for president. For some Libyans, especially in rural areas, the name Gaddafi still carried power, not out of love, but out of longing for stability, for predictable governance, for something familiar in a country that had known nothing but collapse since the dictator's death. That reality, the resurgence of nostalgia for authoritarianism, isn't unique to Libya. Around the world, when democracies fail to deliver safety and order, people look backward. They remember the past, not as it was, but as it felt. Safer, simpler, less violent. In that way, Gaddafi's story and his brutal last hour became a warning, not just about tyranny, but about what comes next if tyranny is replaced with nothing at all. But even as the political narrative unraveled, another truth was becoming clear. Gaddafi's last day wasn't just the end of a life. It was the end of an era in modern Middle Eastern politics. He represented a generation of rulers who believed in absolute control, in personality cults, in the spectacle of strength. He crafted a myth around himself, the philosopher king, the desert revolutionary, the global icon in sunglasses and gold. And when that myth was shattered, not in a speech, but in a sewer, it sent a signal to other strongmen watching around the world. You can be feared for 40 years and still end up alone, dirty, and begging for your life. Some took that message seriously, others doubled down. Bashar al-Assad in Syria saw what happened in Libya and vowed never to let it happen to him. When protests erupted in Damascus, he responded with crushing force, determined not to end up in a ditch. Others, from Venezuela to North Korea, studied Gaddafi's mistake of giving up his nuclear program. They concluded that disarmament meant vulnerability, that once you lose your edge, you become prey. Gaddafi had gambled on diplomacy in his later years, trying to court the West. In the end, it didn't save him, and that lesson changed how dictators around the world calculated risk. But the most haunting part of Gaddafi's final hour isn't just geopolitical, it's psychological, because dictators often build regimes that revolve entirely around themselves. Their face on the money, their words in the textbooks, their paranoia shaping every policy. And when that central figure is gone, the entire system collapses like a dying star. In Gaddafi's case, he ruled not through institutions, but through fear. When that fear dissolved, so did the country, and what emerged wasn't peace. It was 1,000 pieces of a shattered mirror, each reflecting a different version of Libya. In the end, the story of Gaddafi's last day is more than just the end of one man. It's the story of how power isolates, how absolute control creates absolute blindness, until the moment comes, and it always comes, when the palace turns into a trap, the loyalists turn into deserters, and the final escape leads not to a throne, but to a pipe beneath the street. History is supposed to remember everything, but the truth is, it forgets quickly, and it forgets selectively. Some endings are engraved into textbooks, carved into stone, replayed in documentaries. Others fade into silence, tucked away in dusty archives or lost in the noise of new crises. Gaddafi's last day lives somewhere between both, too graphic to forget entirely, too uncomfortable to retell often. It wasn't the kind of death the international community likes to frame as a victory. There was no orderly trial, no solemn announcement, just grainy phone footage, chaos, and the sense that something went terribly wrong, not just in Libya, but in how the world handled its collapse. The West especially struggled with how to speak about Gaddafi after his death. Just a few years earlier, he had been welcomed back into the fold. Tony Blair shook his hand. European leaders did business. The same nations that once bombed his compounds were now signing oil deals. By 2011, those alliances were quietly erased, and when he was killed, the official statements were brief, muted. "A chapter has closed," one leader said. But no one really wanted to read that chapter again. It was too messy, too brutal, and far too familiar. Inside Libya, the aftermath was even more fragmented. For some, Gaddafi's death was justice, raw, immediate, unfiltered justice. For others, it was a missed opportunity. He should have stood trial. He should have answered for the decades of torture, executions, and stolen futures. His death felt like a shortcut, one that denied closure, denied truth. Even his burial was secretive. His body was stored in a cold storage unit for days as leaders argued about what to do. Eventually, he was buried in an unmarked desert grave, guarded so no one could find it. A dictator who once commissioned golden statues of himself was now hidden by the very country he ruled. But memory is hard to bury, especially when it's tied to emotion, fear, anger, regret. In the years after his death, art, graffiti, songs, and stories emerged from every part of Libya. Some celebrated the fall. Others mourned the stability they believed he once provided. Old photos resurfaced, families argued, and slowly a strange nostalgia crept in. Not for Gaddafi the man, but for the illusion of order. The streets may have been silent out of fear before 2011, but now they echoed with gunfire, checkpoints, and rival flags. In the vacuum of power, memory became political. Schools struggled with what to teach. Should they erase Gaddafi's name, condemn him, acknowledge his role in building certain infrastructures? Every version of history became a weapon in the new ideological war. What do you do with a legacy built on blood and manipulation, but also one that for many was the only version of life they had ever known? Gaddafi didn't just dominate politics, he shaped identity. His fall left a psychological crater no constitution could fill. Meanwhile, outside of Libya, his final moments became a warning tale passed quietly among other leaders. In Iran, in Belarus, in Egypt, conversations unfolded behind closed doors. What if this happens here? What if our people rise? What if the world decides we're next? And for opposition groups around the world, the footage of Gaddafi's fall became a symbol, not of hope, but of possibility. Even the most iron-fisted ruler, they realized, can bleed, can hide, can beg. That shift, that mental recalibration, changed the psychology of rebellion across the Middle East and beyond. But for historians, Gaddafi's last hour remains one of the most difficult to analyze, not because of a lack of information, but because of too much noise, conflicting reports, eyewitnesses with trauma-clouded memories, videos that captured fragments, not context. Who fired the fatal shot? Did he die from a bullet or internal bleeding? Was anyone in control that day? Or did the system collapse into spontaneous violence? Unlike the scripted endings of Nuremberg or the measured autopsies of fallen leaders, Gaddafi's death was raw history, the kind that defies neat timelines and academic clarity. And yet, this is why it matters, because real history, not the polished kind, is messy, unpredictable, full of contradictions. Gaddafi's death didn't come with closure, it came with questions about justice, about power, about what happens when the world decides that a regime should end, but doesn't know what to do the morning after. His final hour is a case study not in how dictators fall, but in how we fail to prepare for what comes next. The footage remains online, blurry, chaotic, disturbing. It surfaces and vanishes. Sometimes it's used to celebrate, sometimes to mourn, but it always shocks, because it's not just the fall of a man. It's the unraveling of a story we thought had structure. His life was theater, his politics were spectacle, but his death, it was something else entirely, unspeakable, unscripted. and perhaps inevitable. What happens to a country when its dictator dies before the future is built? That's the question Libya woke up to the morning after Gaddafi's final hour, because while the world's attention shifted to news headlines, to NATO statements, to shaky phone footage replayed on evening broadcasts, the people of Libya were left standing in the wreckage of a broken state. Not just buildings and roads, but identity, direction, trust. Gaddafi had centralized everything around himself, every decision, every promise, every punishment. So when he vanished, there was no institution waiting to take over, no transition plan, just fragments, factions, fighters with flags, and the eerie silence of power suddenly gone. In the weeks after his death, Sirte, the city where he died, didn't celebrate. It grieved, not for him necessarily, but for what had been lost and what had replaced it. Ruins, bloodied walls, homes shattered by shelling. Families had fled during the final siege. Those who returned found neighborhoods flattened, schools turned into bunkers, and bodies still being uncovered. Gaddafi's death may have symbolized the end of an era, but for the residents of Sirte, it was the start of a vacuum. A slow realization that there would be no quick peace, no promised dawn after the dictator. Just more questions, and a new kind of fear, the fear of being forgotten. Meanwhile, across Libya, celebrations gave way to uncertainty. Rebel groups that had fought side by side against Gaddafi now found themselves pointing guns at each other. Each had their own idea of what Libya should become. Some wanted democracy, others wanted Islamism, still others wanted revenge. The National Transitional Council tried to unify them, but it was too little, too late. Without a common enemy, the cracks widened. Cities began operating like mini-states. Militias set up checkpoints. The sound of war didn't end. It just changed tone. And the people? They waited for order, for leadership, for someone to make sense of the chaos. But none came. Instead, foreign powers began picking sides. Weapons flowed in. Money shifted hands. What had begun as a revolution slowly mutated into a proxy war. From Tripoli to Benghazi, the question was no longer what comes next, but who controls what now. The ideals of 2011, freedom, justice, dignity, were replaced by maps, oil contracts, and armored convoys. This was the cruel irony of Gaddafi's legacy. Even in death, he controlled the game because he had built a system where everything depended on him and nothing else was allowed to grow. No real parliament, no free press, no opposition parties. So when he fell, the structure didn't wobble, it collapsed. And into that collapse stepped everyone: warlords, ideologues, smugglers, foreign agents. Libya became a chessboard without rules. And the people? Pawns. Again. In the years that followed, Libya split, literally, east versus west, government versus rival government, a capital in Tripoli, another in Tobruk, and in between, 1,000 checkpoints. Citizens had to navigate not just roads, but politics, which ID to show, which accent to use, which militia controlled which neighborhood that week. Everyday life became a high-stakes game of survival, getting bread, sending a child to school, fixing a broken pipe. All these depended not on laws, but on allegiances. In many ways, it was more exhausting than living under dictatorship, because at least under Gaddafi, the rules, however brutal, were clear, and through it all, the question of his memory loomed. What do you do with a dictator once he's gone? Do you erase his name, destroy his statues, rewrite the textbooks, or do you study him, not to glorify, but to understand? Libya chose silence. His portraits were taken down, his speeches scrubbed from public broadcasts. His old compounds were looted or left to rot. No museums, No biographies, just absence. But absence isn't the same as healing. And in that absence, myths began to regrow. Some whispered that life had been better under him, that at least the streets were safe, that at least the electricity worked. These weren't endorsements of his cruelty, just desperate comparisons. Because after years of war, people weren't asking for democracy anymore. They were asking for stability, security, normalcy, and in the rearview mirror of a collapsed revolution, even tyranny can look orderly. Outside Libya, the world mostly moved on. There were statements, reports, summits, but no real roadmap. The same powers that had helped remove Gaddafi now seemed unsure of what to do next. Intervention fatigue set in. New crises emerged. Syria, Ukraine, global terrorism. Libya faded from the headlines. It became a cautionary tale whispered in policy circles about the dangers of regime change without a plan. But for Libyans, it wasn't a lesson. It was daily life. The children who once watched Gaddafi's face on television were now growing up with entirely new fears. Drone strikes, kidnappings, disappearances. A generation born in the ruins. Some of them never knew Gaddafi, but still lived in his shadow. Because the war didn't just destroy buildings, it tore social fabric. It broke the idea that government could be trusted, that progress could be shared. And when trust dies, rebuilding becomes not just political, but psychological. Today, over a decade later, Libya still grapples with that shadow. The world has changed, the headlines have shifted, but in the streets of Misrata, in the fields around Sirte, in the refugee camps near the borders, the questions remain. Not just about Gaddafi, but about us. About what happens when the world unseats a dictator, but forgets to stay. About what it means to remove a monster, but leave behind his maze. About the cost of revolution without resurrection. Because in the end, Gaddafi's fall wasn't just his story, it was Libya's and ours. A mirror held up to global power, showing what it means to chase justice but abandon structure, to demand freedom but forget the scaffolding that holds it. His final hour was a spectacle, but the real story is everything that came after. When history rewinds footage of Gaddafi's final moments, it doesn't just tell a story about Libya. It reveals something far more chilling: how fear travels across borders. Because while the grainy videos of his capture and death shocked the public, they were studied far more intently behind closed doors, not by citizens, not by victims, but by those in power: dictators, generals, autocrats, leaders who watched the violent unraveling of a regime not to mourn it, but to learn from it, to understand exactly how fast the myth of control can dissolve, and how easily decades of power can end in seconds of chaos. Gaddafi's death became a case study in what not to let happen. His downfall was a lesson, not for democracies, but for tyrants. Across the globe, you could see its ripple effect. Leaders who once ruled with an iron grip began tightening further, not loosening. They changed laws. They expanded surveillance. They built bigger walls around their palaces. Why? Because Gaddafi didn't just lose power, he lost narrative. The image of a dictator begging in a ditch was more powerful than any coup. It didn't just remove him, it humiliated him. It stripped the role of its costume, and no autocrat wanted to be next. Not on camera, not in the streets, not in history books written by rebels. You could see it in Syria. As civil unrest grew, Bashar al-Assad took a different approach. No running, no convoys, no drain pipes. Instead, he dug in. He turned cities into fortresses and negotiated with foreign powers, buying himself more time. Gaddafi had underestimated the collapse. Assad didn't. In Russia, Putin watched carefully. The Libyan revolution reminded him what happens when movements are left to grow unchecked. And so, protests were met with crackdowns. Journalists vanished. Messaging was controlled tighter than ever, because in a world of viral footage, losing control of the image can mean losing control of the throne. Even in places like China, state media covered Gaddafi's death with carefully chosen words, not to support him, but to signal something to their own population. This is what chaos looks like. This is what rebellion brings. They didn't need to glorify him. They just needed the image of collapse to feel terrifying. And in many ways, it worked. Around the world, authoritarian regimes became more cautious, more prepared, more ruthless in protecting their public face. Gaddafi didn't just fall, he forced a new era of control. But there's another layer to this story, because while dictators studied the footage for survival, revolutionaries studied it for strategy. Protest groups, opposition leaders, and underground movements realized something crucial. Tyrants are mortal. They bleed, they beg, they fall apart. The myth of invincibility had been shattered, and that image of a man once larger than life, reduced to panic in a sewer, became a symbol, a reminder that no regime is forever, that fear can collapse, that a camera phone in the right moment can challenge decades of silence. Still, the footage raises hard questions. Was justice served, or was something else unleashed? Gaddafi never stood trial. He never answered for his crimes. There were no witness testimonies, no courtroom confessions, no archive of his defense, just chaos, just screams. And while many Libyans felt relief, others felt robbed of closure, of truth, of the chance to confront their past properly. Because when justice happens in a mob, history becomes a blur, and blurred history breeds confusion. That's why, to this day, some still argue about his final moments. Was he shot on the spot? Was it premeditated? Did anyone try to protect him? Did he say anything before the final bullet? Every version of the story is wrapped in emotion, vengeance, grief, exhaustion. But facts are slippery when the world is screaming. And in that silence afterward, the truth remains half-formed, half-remembered, half-lost. Meanwhile, Gaddafi's legacy keeps resurfacing in unlikely places. His name has become a symbol of everything from tyranny to collapse. Some conspiracy theorists claim he was taken out not by rebels, but by powers threatened by his financial moves, like plans for a gold-backed African currency. Others believe his downfall was part of a broader strategy to reset control over North Africa. But beyond the theories, one thing is clear. His end created a vacuum, and nature, as always, abhors a vacuum. In that vacuum came militias, warlords, smugglers, foreign armies. Libya became a hub for human trafficking, weapons trades, and geopolitical tug-of-wars. The Mediterranean became a deadly crossing point for migrants fleeing the instability. And Europe, just across the sea, struggled to understand how the fall of one man could trigger such wide-ranging consequences. But that's the thing with strong men. When they centralize everything around themselves, their fall is not just personal, it's national, sometimes even regional. And what about the people still loyal to him? They didn't disappear overnight. Some regrouped, some fled, some stayed silent. A few tried to re-enter politics under new names. Others joined armed groups hoping to reclaim the old order. But time had moved on. Libya, for better or worse, was no longer Gaddafi's country. It was a battlefield of competing futures, and none of them looked like the past. Yet in private, in whispers, some still speak of the days before. Some miss the order, the certainty, the subsidies, the illusion of unity. That's the dangerous part of nostalgia. It forgets the cost. It remembers the safety, but not the silence. The roads, but not the prisons. The speeches, but not the disappearances. And in a country still searching for a path forward, those memories can shape elections, loyalties, and wars. Globally, Gaddafi's death changed how the world thinks about intervention. Some saw it as a necessary end to tyranny, others saw it as a warning of what happens when regime change skips the planning phase. NATO's involvement, once hailed, is now debated. Was it right to intervene without securing the peace? Could diplomacy have avoided the collapse? Should there have been a trial? These questions don't have easy answers, but they shape every discussion of foreign policy that followed. From Syria to Afghanistan to Ukraine, the ghost of Gaddafi lingers. Because in the end, his story wasn't just about one man. It was about the architecture of power, how it's built, how it's challenged, and how, when it falls, the dust doesn't settle for years. His last hour may have been brutal, but the aftershocks stretched far beyond the walls of that drainpipe, across continents, across ideologies, across generations. And for those still chasing justice, still navigating broken streets, still rebuilding lives in a fractured Libya, that hour never truly ended. It echoes in every failed promise, in every unmarked grave, in every child born into a war they didn't start. What does the last hour of a man like Gaddafi truly teach us? Not just about the man himself, but about the world that created him, enabled him, feared him, and ultimately watched him fall. Because no dictator rises alone, and no dictator dies without leaving behind something deeper than wreckage. A mirror, one that reflects not just the tyrant's flaws, but our own thresholds, our silence, our compromises, our fascination with power, and our reluctance to challenge it until it collapses under its own weight. Gaddafi's fall wasn't a sudden twist of fate. It was a long, drawn-out revelation, a peeling away of layers until all that remained was a man hiding in a pipe, waiting for the inevitable. His medals couldn't protect him. His gold-plated guns couldn't buy him time. His long speeches, his fiery declarations, none of them mattered when the people finally closed in. But maybe the most unsettling lesson of his end isn't what happened in those last moments. It's what didn't happen. There was no real reckoning, no public truth-telling, no clear handover to justice, just chaos. And when justice vanishes, so does memory, because what we don't record, we start to rewrite. Already, you can find voices online trying to humanize Gaddafi, to frame his downfall as Western interference, to cast him as a victim of empire rather than a brutal leader who ruled through fear and control. And the truth? It's not that simple. He was both. A man caught between myth and monstrosity, someone who held real dreams for African unity and education reform, while also torturing dissenters in underground prisons, someone who spoke of independence, while silencing every opposing voice in his own country. His contradictions weren't flaws, they were his system. He governed by confusion, by charisma, mixed with cruelty, and it worked, until it didn't. But now we're left with another kind of contradiction, how to remember a man who caused so much pain, but left behind such a powerful symbol. Gaddafi's final hour was ugly, yes, but it was also magnetic. The world couldn't look away. That's the danger with these kinds of deaths. They don't end stories. They create legends. And legends, especially the violent kind, have a way of circling back. In Libya, years after his death, posters still appear. His name is still whispered. Some see him as the last figure of unity, others as the monster who tore the country apart. Both versions exist because neither was buried properly. We often think of history as something settled, timelines, facts, outcomes, but in reality, it's made of fragments, emotions, half-told memories, viral images, and edited videos. A dictator's death doesn't just end a regime. It begins 1,000 arguments about what could have been, what should have been, and what should never happen again. But if we're not careful, those lessons dissolve. just like the footage from that October day. Compressed, reshared, turned into grainy artifacts that lose their weight with every repost. The screams fade, the dust settles, the meaning gets lost in the noise. That's why storytelling matters, not to glorify the violence, but to remember the structure, how tyranny grows, how it survives, and how it dies, so we don't repeat it. Gaddafi didn't just fall because people rose up. He fell because the system that protected him, fear, loyalty, misinformation, began to crack. And when enough cracks form, even the strongest wall shatters. But here's the uncomfortable part. Those cracks don't appear overnight. They grow slowly, silently, in the compromises we make, the truths we avoid, the voices we ignore, and by the time we notice the wall shaking, it's already too late. So ask yourself, how many regimes are still standing today because no one's kicked the pipe open yet? How many leaders are hiding behind the illusion of power, hoping the cameras never turn on them? How many nations are still one bad decision away from repeating October 20th, 2011? Because Gaddafi's last hour wasn't just about Libya, it was about the illusion of control, the myth that a single man can stand forever, and the danger of believing silence means peace. In the end, his gold-plated pistol was just a relic. His loyalists were just shadows, and his legacy, it's still being written, not in books, but in the lives of the people trying to survive the country he left behind. So the next time we watch a regime fall, or see a palace overrun, or hear chants in the street, remember that power doesn't vanish, it shifts, and if we don't catch where it goes, we might find ourselves telling the story again, with a different name, a different country, a different drainpipe, but the same silence, the same disbelief, the same brutal echo of what happens when absolute rule finally collapses, not in a speech, but in the dirt. When the dust finally settled, there were no parades, no headlines that could fully explain what had happened, just a quiet stretch of road in Sirte, and a shadow where a regime used to stand. Gaddafi's reign didn't end with a legacy. It ended with a silence that still hasn't been filled. And maybe that's the lesson. No matter how loud power speaks, it always ends in quiet.